Whenever Valve releases a new game, exceptions withstanding, they always revolutionize whatever genre that game falls into and set a new standard across the industry. The Half-Life, Portal, Team Fortress, and Counter-Strike franchises are paramount examples of this phenomenon. Half-Life continually raises the bar for what's possible in immersive 3D environments. Portal expands the scope of puzzles and characterization in games. Team Fortress simultaneously invented and set the standard for hero-based shooters, while also displaying just how far stylization can be taken. And Counter-Strike is widely considered the pinnacle of tactical shooters. With all this being taken into account, is Counter-Strike 2 going to push the industry like all of its forefathers? Or is it just a glorified update repackaged into a different game? First, let's tackle the question of, what exactly is Counter-Strike 2? Earlier this week, as of writing the script, Valve released 3 videos on their official YouTube channel, as well as some extra sneak peeks on the official Counter-Strike Twitter account, showcasing their new game releasing this summer, Counter-Strike 2. Now, from a surface level, this exact situation brings to mind echoes of another game marketed as a sequel, when in reality is a same game, different name situation. But unlike that aforementioned game, Counter-Strike 2 seems to be shaping up to be much more than a graphics update with a fancy new wrapping slapped onto it. Let's take a look at some of the revealed features, shall we?
Yeah. Hold it now.
Firstly, let's talk about what most of the internet has been going buck wild about at the moment. The improved volumetric smoke grenades. I'm not going to spend too much time on this one since, well, I mean, just look at it. Smoke like this has never been accomplished in a mainstream video game ever before, especially to this degree. The level of interactivity you can have with it is absolutely mind-boggling. But, like I said before, there isn't much to go in depth about here. Since the game hasn't actually been released yet, it's very much a what you see is what you get situation. But of course, if Counter-Strike 2 just had a better smoke and that was all, I don't think it'd be deserving of a standalone game. So, let's talk about the improved visuals are very apparent when comparing areas across Counter-Strike games. With maps like Dust 2 acting as touchstones to compare across versions, you can tell just how much the graphics have gotten a facelift since CSGO. While it's not as much of a drastic improvement as something like Counter-Strike to CS Source, or CS Source to CSGO, it's still certainly a noticeable and substantial improvement. But, like I said before, with the game not being out yet and me not having access to the beta, I can't offer a direct comparison of the maps are another thing that's going to change in Counter-Strike 2. Is this a good thing? Well, I'm usually an advocate for change, and a little shakeup is always healthy for the meta of any game. But knowing the Counter-Strike community, they are very protective of their maps. Fortunately, Valve seems to know this and split the Counter-Strike 2 map pool into 3 distinct categories: Touchstone, Upgrades, and Overhauls. Touchstone maps, like the sexy Counter-Strike 2 man says, have gotten Source 2 visual improvements, but their foundations have stayed entirely the same. This is actually a pretty smart decision on Valve's part to keep some of these classic maps around, because it can allow experienced players to compare and contrast the changes between Counter-Strike 2 and the rest of the Counter-Strike games in a controlled environment. Upgraded maps are very similar to their previous games' counterparts, but Valve doubled down on the Source 2 enhancements with much better lighting and, quote, a physically based rendering system that produced realistic materials, lighting, and reflections. Overhauled maps are where it finally starts to get interesting beyond just visual stuff. The oldest maps, which the community likes less than Dust 2, were rebuilt from the ground up and are where people are likely going to see the most obvious changes to rendering and gameplay, because they're essentially new maps for Counter-Strike 2 just under the name of the one it took inspiration from. I'd also like to point out as a little side tangent what Valve only showed for 7 seconds. A brand spankin' new map editor which looks leagues more user-friendly than the old Hammer editor we know and love and loathe today. But of course, we'll just have to know it when we see it. Finally, I'd like to talk about what was covered in the least viewed of the 3 teasers Valve put out, but is arguably the most earth-shattering change integrated into Counter-Strike 2. The sub-tick updates. For those of you who don't know, pretty much every video game on Earth operates using a discrete tick system. From multiplayer games to even single-player games, every single game operates on this discrete tick system. To explain how it works in a nutshell, imagine a metronome ticking, let's say, twice every second. In almost every game to date, every input you make is recorded and only happens once that metronome ticks. If you were to press 2 buttons at slightly different times in between ticks, those 2 inputs will be pushed to the next tick and occur at the same time. Alternatively, if you push 2 buttons at slightly different times, but a tick just so happens to be in the middle of the 2 inputs, the first input would happen on the first tick, but the second input would have to wait until the next tick, resulting in the 2 inputs happening at entirely different times. Fortunately, games tick at such a fast rate that everything operates as expected nearly all of the time. However, in more skill-based games where inputs have to be frame perfect, a discrete tick system can have unintended and detrimental consequences. An example of just how much this system can have unforeseen consequences is how crouch kicks, a speedrunning tech in Titanfall 2, which was heavily dependent on frame-perfect inputs, almost ruined the speedrunning community. I'll link a video in the description if you want to learn more. Also, discrete tick systems can sometimes be responsible for when you obviously shoot some guy in the head, but the server just says, no, and you get a hit sound, but no damage is actually done, and ranting aside, the new sub-tick system, which Counter-Strike 2 is introducing, if it works as presented, is entirely independent on update times or frame rates or even tick rates for that matter. Whenever you make an input, it just happens. No waiting for that imaginary metronome to tick or anything. It just happens at the very moment you press that button. This could simultaneously have amazing and detrimental effects on gaming communities across the globe. For hugely tactical spaces, this system will be a godsend, because it completely negates the slight RNG that discrete tick systems bring to the table. And when every millisecond counts, having your input be as precise as possible can be the difference between walking away with $1 million or not. On the other hand, I expect speedrunning and heavily movement-based communities to shy away from the sub-tick system, because I expect it will make frame-perfect inputs significantly more difficult to pull off. Tried and true techniques like bunny hopping will be harder than ever to pull off, and techs which require 2 inputs at the same time will be nigh impossible. For the casual players though, I don't expect much change. But if there's one thing I do know, is that I will be having one unproductive summer.